Hi everyone, welcome to the Art of the Possible series. I'm Nihali Niyogi and I am a Principal Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft. Today's topic is Azure Data Factory Networking, and we will also cover Fabric Data Factory. We envision this series to be a multi-part series, and we will be sharing future videos on other data services like Databricks networking, Cosmos networking, and others in the future. With me, I have two of my esteemed colleagues, Daniel and Gabe, who will be sharing valuable insights with us. Daniel, Gabe, I've truly enjoyed working with you and for being available to collaborate and bounce off ideas. With that, Daniel, I'll let you introduce yourself and then Gabe.
Thank you, Nihali. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Mauser. I'm a cloud and AI infrastructure solution engineer. Recently, I transitioned for the network in GBB. And what I have to offer you here is my knowledge related to networking, and there is a lot of moving parts with the ADF and related to private endpoints and DNS. And I hope you enjoy the session. And thanks for having me, Nihali.
Of course.
Thank you, Nahali. Thank you, Daniel. I'm Gabe. I'm a solution engineer for the AI Foundry Azure Machine Learning team with I specialize in the networking side. I'm more here today to listen in, learn, and ask questions to gain insights perhaps that may seem obvious for the experts here, but may not be for everyone else. So thank you for the opportunity, Holly.
Of course. Thank you both for joining. And with that, let me share my screen. You guys can already see my screen, right? Awesome. Thank you. With that, let's get started. If you're following along with me, this screen will look very familiar with you, and we will jump between portal demos and Draw.io, and we'll bake troubleshooting into this. So if something fails, we will fix it together. All right. So the tool that I'm using is a Draw.io, and we will be using layers to tell the story. Now, in the beginning, I'm going to cover the key concepts. If you come from a data factory background, this would be very clear for you, so you can jump to the next chapter. But for our networking audience, Azure Data Factory is used for data movement and orchestration. And some of the key points I have highlighted in yellow. So as you can see, there is data movement that happens from on-prem to cloud. It could even be multi-cloud. And then when there is data ingestion between multiple sources, that's where a lot of the networking and the private endpoint components come into play. And the other key component is the pipeline. And the pipeline is used for orchestrating data flows. So we will be looking at that in the portal as well. I have grabbed a picture from our Azure documentation over here. This is showing the full pipeline. We will be focusing on the data sources over here. So we will be using storage as our source and SQL, Azure SQL database as our sink. Okay, and then I got a good picture of the pipeline where you could see that the source could be Amazon S3 because it could be multi-cloud, so it could be our input data set, and the output data set could be Azure storage. In this particular diagram, they're also showing the multi-cloud data movement. So as you see over here, it's on-prem to cloud, multi-cloud, and that's where a lot of the networking comes into play. I also wanted to highlight a few of the integration, a few of the key concept, and integration runtime is more of a compute infrastructure. I grabbed this definition from ChatGPT, and I really liked the way it describes integration runtime is more of the muscle and compute infrastructure, and ADF as the brain. So data factory as the brains, and IR integration runtime as the muscle, which is the compute infrastructure that we will be deploying. And there are three types of integration runtime I have listed over here. And we will be focusing on integration runtime self-hosted and the integration runtime cloud-hosted. And it could also be the fully managed, the one with the managed VNet. Okay, there is comparisons between different type of integration runtime, and I want to highlight this because there is a lot of the networking bits over here. So the ones that I have highlighted in yellow, what decides the different integration runtime is whether or not we could access the sources, the source and the sink from on-prem privately versus publicly. Okay, so I like this table. It's taken right out of our documentation. The link, if you click, if you have access to this Draw.io, which you can, of course, download from my GitHub, it has links to the documentation as well. So basically, if you need your sources to be accessible from on-prem or with private endpoint, the Azure integration runtime with managed VNet and self-hosted integration runtime supports it. Okay, so those are just really the concepts and why we are doing this session, and I wanted to highlight the network integration points. Any questions before we go into our first sort of scenario?
Yeah, a quick question here. For the self-hosted integration runtime, does that mean these are containers running on users' virtual networks?
So that's a good question, Gabe. For self-hosted integration runtime, you can either download the MSI installer and run it on a VM, or you could install it as a Windows container. I haven't tested it, but we will put it in the link below, a link to the Azure documentation that talks about how to install it in a Windows container. All right. And given this is a networking demo, I would be running it locally on my laptop with a point-to-site VPN and on a VM in Azure. Of course, in the real world, you would want to ensure that wherever you run your integration runtime, the CPU, memory, and the network bandwidth is available depending on your data volume. All right. Great question, Gabe. So in my first scenario, and this is usually the starting point for most of my sessions, so this should look very, very familiar, but just to kind of go over, the top half is Azure VNet hub and spoke architecture, and the bottom half is on-prem connected via some sort of private connectivity, express route, site-to-site, point-to-site. And then this blue box is Azure PaaS services, and this is also Azure PaaS, but Azure Data Factory, the one of interest for today's session. So let's look at the big picture. So in the big picture, I want to point out all the different integration runtimes. Okay, so there are 4 different. The bottom 2 are essentially the same. So I have color coded them. So the first one is the Azure AutoResolve integration runtime, which is essentially public access. Then we have the managed VNet. So let me make this a little bit smaller. Managed VNet is fully managed by Azure and Microsoft. And again, this integration runtime is nothing but a piece of compute. And then we have the self-hosted one, and as you see, Gabe, a self-hosted one, I have kind of attached it to the VM. So it's running inside the VM in Azure. And then this is the one on-prem, which I will, when I do the demo, I'll be running it on my desktop and then connecting via point-to-site VPN. Okay, so you could see that from a placement perspective, one is in a managed VNet, one is fully public. So there is a lot of networking that is involved when you want to connect to sources from this integration runtime to other sources. Source could be on-prem, another cloud. So let's go with the the first scenario now in a deeper way. Any question on the big picture, or should we dive into the first scenario? That's good. Okay. All right. So in the first scenario, we're going to do the public networking. So as you can see, I have a little screen capture from the Azure portal. This is where you can just pick the public endpoint, and with that, what happens is the integration runtime is deployed in Azure Data Factory, fully managed by Microsoft. And then if you think of how you will access the source and the sink, um, the source and sink, it would be accessed over the public networking. So one of the differences that we saw is that if you needed private access, this is not the right integration runtime. But let's start with public, and then we will go into private. So you can see that the source and the sink is accessed over the public internet. And then, of course, inbound to the PaaS is also public. Of course, you can restrict it with the firewall on the PaaS service itself. And then to access the Data Factory Studio, you would also be from on-prem, you would also be using public. So this is all public, of course, not recommended for production scenarios. This is labs or POC kind of thing. So we'll start there, and then we'll work our way into private networking. Let me jump on to the portal and kick off the demo. So here we will just create the data factory. So call it 101 just in case I have something already. All right, and then we'll just go with the public endpoint. And here you can enable the managed one. If we don't enable it now, we could do it later as well. So to start with, we will go with public endpoint. We'll go ahead and kick off the install. So this shouldn't take very long. So essentially what we will do is we can either jump on a VM here, but given this is public, I will just do this from my laptop here. And I'm not yet connected to the VPN. Okay, great. So Data Factory is provisioned. And the first thing we can do is we can launch the studio. Well, let's take a quick look at the networking. So it's public endpoint and no private endpoints here. And then let's launch the studio. The first thing I think we can look at is the integration runtime. Now, if you're not familiar with the Studio, Azure Data Factory Studio, there are a few things that I've personally learned that are useful from the networking perspective. Are this Manage tab, we'll go into the details there, and then the Author tab where you can author a pipeline. Of course, there's a lot more to it, but those are the key ones for network integration. So the first thing we will look at is, let's see what happened to the integration runtime. And you can see that out of the box, notice how it deployed the public subtype. So this is kind of jumping back in this is this one, the public one. Okay, and the way I'm accessing the adf.azure.com is using public access. Okay, any questions? I'm just going to make sure I didn't miss anything.
So right now your ADF Studio is public, is that correct?
Yes, it is
Are
public.
there any ways of making the studio private as well with public network access disabled?
Yes, so we can actually go forward in the next scenario. We will make it private. Yes. So
Awesome.
we will do that, and then, but just to complete this demo, let's create the pipeline. So with the pipeline, what we will do, and this pipeline is common for all of the scenarios. I have something in the storage, and we will use the pipeline to move the data to Azure SQL. So let me show you my storage and then my SQL database, and then we'll move data from here to here using the pipeline. First, we will do everything, of course, publicly. So kind of jumping back here, let's go to let me first show you all the storage. Well, I'll show you the SQL Server. SQL Server, there's no private endpoint, and public network access is selected networks only. And then likewise in storage, networking, sometimes this gets, because of our policies and our internal subscription, I may have to tweak that a little bit. But let's see this. There's no private endpoint, and public right now is enabled. And let's look at the configuration. And let's look at what I have as a source. I have a very simple CSV file called bike sales sample, and I kept it really, really simple. So if you go in here, you could take a look that it has just this. Okay, and in the SQL Server, just in the interest of time, what I had done is I created just one table called bike sales table. This is the query I used to create that, but there is nothing in it. So if we say select star from it, there is no content. There's no rows in it. So with the pipeline, we will migrate data from storage to this table. So at the end of this exercise, we should have, when we run this query again, we'll have that. So this pipeline that we are going to develop now will stay common across all the scenarios, but the only thing that will change is the sources and sinks will become private. So right now, everything's public. So me go to this other tab, author tab. Author tab is where we would create a pipeline. So we can start creating the pipeline. We can call this demo ADF pipeline. And then we could just create a copy pipeline. Well, here, before we do that, there are two important constructs. One is called linked services, and the other one is data sets. So we'll start by creating linked services. So linked services is where the glue is. So if we, let's do Azure Blob Storage, that's the storage account that I just showed you. And we will call it Azure Blob Storage LS link service, and then we will select our storage account that I showed you, and we will just say create. Okay, so this links. Oh, I missed one thing I could have shown you here. There's a good test connection button over here. So it comes in handy when you have, oh, this is good. It failed. Let's see what happened. So it says that. So let's see what's going on. Let's go check the storage account. So again, this is a good button for troubleshooting. Look at the networking. Let's see what we missed. So we want to say Enable from all
All
networks.
networks, yes, to be fully
Okay.
public access.
I see what we did. Okay, so I only had a specific. Okay, that's what I missed. Okay, good call. All right, let's see. Okay, so now let's run it again. The test connection, and it should be successful. Okay, great. So our source is the blob. Let's create our linked service for our sink, which is Azure SQL. Azure SQL Database, LS, linked service, subscription, this server name. So it picks up our database and server name and everything. So let's do a test connection. Great. Text connect. So this is what stitches it together, and we can continue to use the same linked services later as well. So linked services are done. Let's create our data set. So data set is in the author tab. So we'll go and create the data sets. So for the data sets, we'll call it blob. Azure Blob Storage. It's a CSV file, and we will call it storage blob. And then we'll use this linked service, okay, that we created. So we have to create the linked services first, and now we should be able to browse our bike sales sample CSV. Okay, cool. So that's our data set, first data set, and then we'll create our sync data set. So we say add new data set, and we'll call it Azure SQL. Okay, and here we can select our table, the one that I showed you before. It wasn't populated. Okay, cool. Okay, so now we have our source and our sink. So let's go back to our pipeline, and we will, as you can see, the source and sink is red. So we could just pick our source as storage blob. You can also preview the data if you want to check. So you can see that the source is looking good. And sink, let's look at the sink. And we'll call it SQL table. And here, I think we're ready to, so our source and sink is set up. We're ready to trigger the pipeline. And at the end of that, the data from the CSV file should go into the SQL. It does the mapping automatically. So it does the schema mapping and things automatically. I mean, if there are complex files, you may have to do, but that's outside of the scope of this video. So I kept the file very simple to demonstrate the network bits. So let's go ahead and kick off the debug. Any questions while we wait for this? Making sense?
Makes sense, Nehali. I just want to highlight two things. And I think one, for example, we had the storage account in the, we have like a file option there, right? It seems for Data Factory, you don't have that option, right? It's either public or private, correct?
Yes, good point. Yeah, let's look at that as well. So yeah, let's first look at that one. So in Data Factory, yes, good point. There is no option for the firewall.
In order to restrict public access, correct? And which kind of makes sense because you cannot, for example, if you're getting the sources from different paths, right? You cannot kind of restrict that, which would make sense, but more compared to storage accounts, right? I mean, But it's interesting that the past solutions, they may have different features, which in this case, ADF does not have the file options compared to storage accounts.
Right. And like this is also for, so this is for integration runtime. I think if you remember when we were, right. So because ADF is a global construct, it would always be reachable by public, but this one is applicable to only the integration runtime, self-hosted integration runtime.
Got it. And another highlight, if you go back to your diagram, so when you mention, for example, right now we're doing this sync between storage account, right? We create the data line where we have storage account as a source and SQL as destination. And it's also important distinction here for the audience to understand is, although this is kind of using public IP, that interaction between those three components, they are within Azure, they stay on the Microsoft backbone, right? It's not technically public internet. Obviously, if you're getting data from on-premises in this case, it's going to be public internet. But I think it's good to have that sense that although this is not really, it's using public IPs, but technically stays in the Microsoft backbone, because source and destination and the data factory are sitting inside the Microsoft backbone. Makes sense?
Yes, great point. Yeah, so in this particular scenario, they're staying on the Microsoft backbone, but the classic use case for AutoResolve integration runtime, so this red box, is, as we saw, that it could also be, let's say, if it was S3, for example, Amazon S3 or any other multi-cloud sort of, or on-prem, like you mentioned, then it would not be traversing. Yes.
I just want to make that highlight.
No, great call out. Yes, absolutely. When the source and sink are both in Azure, yes, it will go. Yeah, that question comes up quite a bit. So.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, great
so,
discussions.
Nahali, with the public, since ADF only has public or private access, does that mean anytime someone wants to connect to it privately, they have to use a private endpoint, or are there other alternatives?
Yes, to connect to these two privately, we would need private endpoints, and that is our next scenario.
Would private resolvers potentially help with this too, or?
Yes, exactly. So, and that's where Daniel is going to go into a very deep discussion on DNS. You cannot talk about private endpoint without DNS. So, and you and I both know where even with other sessions we've done, DNS becomes a critical piece. So, no other than Daniel to explain that piece to us. So we'll have a treat a little bit later.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Great stuff. So yeah, so let's see, our pipeline did finish. It looks it succeeded. And the other important thing, this becomes more obvious, more important when we look at the integration runtime. Notice it says AutoResolve, right? So as we move through different integration runtime, this column is a good one to observe. So now let's go to our SQL server and run that same query again. As you saw before, we got 0 rows. So if we run it again, great, our data is moved. So any questions? I think now we can go into the second scenario, which is the self-hosted one. But before that, any other question before we go into that? I think any other call outs that I missed? Let me check my notes here as well.
I think you're good. You covered very well, Nehali.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. To summarize scenario number 1, we saw that we have source and sink that are public, and of course you can have an optional source which is somewhere in any other cloud. Here I've shown Amazon S3, and the flows from on-prem would work like this. and the flows to the source and sink all public. And the use case over here, as noted, is mostly if you have public endpoints in other cloud and the compute is managed by Microsoft. So in all the scenarios, I would list the use case over here. So if you're following along on the Draw.io, you will be able to see that. So now let's look at the second scenario. In the second scenario, the integration runtime would be on-prem. And we would be using private endpoints. So for the source, the sink, and the data factory. So we would be using private endpoints for the source and sink, and we would be using private endpoints for Azure Data Factory. And you will see that the flows would work something like this. But what you see over here is strictly IP routing. What we are missing in this picture is DNS. So all bets are off if DNS is not set up correctly. And for that, we have Daniel, who's going to go over and do a deep dive on DNS, hybrid DNS, and no other than Daniel to explain this concept. Daniel, I have learned a lot from your blogs, so please share your insights with our audience. Over to you.
Thank you, Nehali. Yeah, let me share my screen. Before I go into the details of the ADF private endpoints, it's like Nehali has mentioned, DNS plays a big role to make sure you can consume the IP routing properly. So before you expose to the private endpoints, just to get a little bit situated, everything goes over a public endpoint. And when you expose that ADF to private link, private endpoint, that is going to get exposed to a private IP within your virtual network. But in order to resolve that private IP, we're going to leverage DNS. And when you set up in DNS with Azure, there are a couple considerations that I'm going to cover in this session. For that, I'm going to leverage a lab that I have in my GitHub. Nehali is going to add the link for the lab. Primarily, this lab covers DNS scenarios with the new Azure DNS Private Resolver. Taking consideration that DNS Private Resolver is an Azure first-party product, if you want, you don't need to use a custom DNS in a VM. But obviously, anything that I'm explaining here also is applicable if you have your own DNS solution. So to walk through this lab, I'm going to use this scenario for private DNS name resolution, which is the scenario 1. The focus of this lab is primarily storage accounts. However, what I'm going to do here is reuse this lab, and you can use the same thing. You can plug in any type of passive solutions like ADF. And for that, let me just give a quick walkthrough. And when you build this lab, that's exactly what you're going to get. As you see on the left, we have emulated on-premises with an Azure client VM, a VM that's running the Windows DNS server. We do have a gateway, which has an IPsec tunnel to a gateway that's sitting in the hub network, which is, in this case, in the right side, we do have the Azure side. In our case, like I mentioned, we are using the native private DNS private resolver. And the main goal here, as you see in the green flow, is to make sure my on-premises is capable to do the name resolution for any private endpoint that I expose in Azure. As you see in this diagram, we do have storage accounts, but in my case, I'm going to re-expose live with you the ADF, the data portion, the data portion, as well as the portal. If you move forward to the environment here, we're not going to cover the spokes, but the whole idea is, as you see on the top, we do have a private link blob core windows.net, which in our case is going to be data factory azure.net. That's going to get exposed. is going to get linked to the hub network where we have the DNS component. And that DNS component is going to be the entry point for any name resolution coming from on-premises. And within Azure, you can leverage two options. You can link that DNS private link to any VNet, or you can forward any requests from those workloads directly to your DNS, your own DNS solution, which in our case is going to be the DNS resolver. So let's jump in. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I do have a data factory that I created. And before we move forward, do you have any questions? Any considerations?
Yeah, Daniel, going back to your diagram over there, you mentioned that for the spokes, you could point the DNS to the inbound endpoint. Can you also set it at the spoke VNet level, the DNS?
Correct. So we have two choices here, right? Our recommendation is always to use the Azure provided DNS. As you see in each one of those VNets, we do have Azure provided DNS because it's the one it's less configuration complexity. But technically, if you have your own DNS solution, you require to change that DNS setting in each VNet to point to the IP of your DNS server. In the private resolver, technically, you can also do the same thing. You can point, instead of using the Azure provided DNS, you can point to the IP, configure the VNet level of your spoke to point to the inbound endpoint of the DNS private resolver. That makes sense?
Yes, perfect. Yeah, thank you.
And all right, let me switch back to the data factory that I have. And inside data factory, my goal here is to expose, which is currently as a public endpoint. Technically, I can have hybrid. I can still keep in the public endpoint if you still need access over the public, and also expose at the same time as a private connection. But obviously, most of the customers, the main goal is going to be, okay, I want only to access that ADF privately. And in this case, I'm going to switch to private endpoint to remove the public access. And as soon as I do this, I need to expose that ADF now in my Azure virtual network as a private endpoint. In the ADF specifically, you have to do one for each type of resource, which I'm going to cover right now. So the first thing that I'm going to do is expose the private endpoint for the data factory itself, which I'm going to call here PE. I'm going to call ADF. And then this PE ADF is going to get exposed as a network interface in the VNet. In my case, I do have already my VNet inside that resource group within that region. And I'm going to pick, like I mentioned, we do have two sub-resources, which is the data factory itself, which covers the data plane. And the control plane to access the data factory portal, we need to rerun the same private endpoint, and later I'm going to do that because I'm going to expose both of them. I'm going to expose first the data factory. And in this specific scenario, if you go back to my diagram, I will expose the ADF private endpoint in the hub VNet. So it's not reflected in my diagram, but I created a specific subnet called PE subnet, where I'm going to expose that data factory private endpoint. I'm going to get dynamically one IP that's allocated for that subnet. In the next piece, it's going to be integrate that with the private DNS zone. If you switch it back to my diagram, in my diagram, what's reflecting is the blob core for the storage account. In this case, what I'm doing here, it's creating the private DNS zone where all my PEs, my private endpoints for ADF, any subsequent one that I'm creating In this case, I'm just creating one in the hub, but any other one that I'm creating over the spokes, they're going to reuse the same zone for the data factory. So if I switch back over here, and you see that's going to already provide the data factory. And because you are going to be, and I'm going to explain a little bit later, that's very important, is we always add that prefix of private link, which is a subdomain of your data factory. So the private link, you're going to become authoritative for the private link zone, because you're going to have your private entries for the private endpoints inside that DNS zone. So I'm going to hit next, and I'm going to create that private endpoint. Should not take too long. And we're going to review the configuration in a few seconds. I'm going to redo the same thing to the ADF for the portal. So I'm going to go to the networking private endpoint. I'm going to just speed up a little bit on this because I already explained you this portion. I'm going to call PE ADF portal. It's going to do the same thing, the NIC. And this time, instead of data factory, I'm going to get the portal. I'm going to attach to the same VNET, hub VNET, and the PE subnet that is dedicated to the private endpoints. The only difference here that we have compared to the first one is a different DNS zone. If you take a look, I'm going to try to highlight here. We have the private link ADF azure.com, and that's obviously different from the data factory that you created before, because this one reflects the access to the portal. So we're going to create this new DNS zone just for the portal. Hit next, hit create. And we should have in a few seconds the private endpoint for the ADF portal exposed to that subnet. If I switch back to the resource group, another point that I forgot to explain is because I'm using the private resolver, these zones that I just created, because I created the private endpoints directly in the same VNet as the private resolver resides, that VNet link, and I'm going to show you in a few seconds, that DNS zones that we created for Data Factory in the other one for the portal, they're going to get linked automatically to the private resolver. That's the only requirement that you need to do. You don't need to do any kind of configuration on the DNS private resolver in order to consume those private link zones that I just created. So that's another very important, because I've seen some customers doing like rule sets, but that's not the goal here. The fact that you only linking the resolve is going to be capable to query the zones that are linked to the hub VNet. And I'm going to show you very quick about it. Another point that I want to highlight is the only configuration that I have for this scenario in the private resolver is the endpoint, inbound endpoint, which is going to get exposed as an IP inside the VNet. And the main goal of this IP is to be consumed by resources that are outside of Azure. So in this case, I'm going to give a little bit of explanation here is, and you can ask me, oh, why I cannot reach from on-premises directly the private link zone. You need something in the middle, which in this case is the private resolver or a custom DNS server, because the reason why this zone can only be accessed by the magic IP of 168.63.129.16, which is an Azure construct on the SDN to be leveraged inside Azure. So that IP, which is going to be leveraged by the resolver or any VM that's inside Azure, they can consume that IP and reach that zone. That IP is not routable from on-premises, and that's why we need to expose a routable IP or something that can be accessed from on-premises, which in this case is DNS private resolver, in order to send the query to the resolver, and then from the resolver is going to reach out the SDN over that magic IP and reach out the private link zone for ADF, which is in our case is ADF. Want to pause? Any questions?
No questions, but just wanted to emphasize what you just said, Daniel. We've seen more than we see customers asking about this, that 168.63 IP is not routable. So this private DNS resolver solves that issue. So you can route to the inbound IP, right? So that's the beauty of this design.
That's correct. Yeah, let me move forward. Let's do a quick review on the, so this is what the only configuration that I need in my resolver, which is to expose the inbound endpoint, which I have the 10.20.164. And just write down this IP because we're going to use that in few seconds to properly configure our on-premise DNS to reach out that to make sure that the private link DNS resolution works properly. And if you go, I go back to the actual resource group. We're going to see that we may I created the PEs, the private endpoints for ADF. As you see, we have the private endpoint itself icon, but we always have a pair of the private endpoint plus the network interface. But if I click in the first one that I created, you can kind of review all the information that you needed, the VNET and the subnet that it has been exposed, the target sub resource, which is the data plane of the data factory. And also you can see the other two components that are only reviewing this resource. So you can see everything combined, which is the NIC, which is going to tell you exactly what is the IP that NIC. The only I would say function of that NIC is to reserve that IP. So it's not the same NIC that you attach to a VM. So it's the goal of this NIC is just to hold that IP inside the subnet where I assign the private endpoint. So which I do have here 2106. And down below on the DNS configuration, we're going to see the private link data factory, Azure VNET, which has a record of my public name of my with the prefix of the private endpoint. So so the goal here is when I try to resolve Mauser ADF data factory Azure.net, the goal is to resolve that private endpoint. Let me move to the, so this is actually the zone, and another portion of the zone that we need to take a look is the virtual network link. Like I mentioned, this virtual network link, the action of creating the private endpoint creates the VNET link of the private link to the hub VNET, which in this case is how the Azure DNS private resolver is going to be capable to redirect the query in order to resolve the private link zone. Sounds good. Let me move to the resource group. We do have the second one, which is the portal. So if you go to the PE ADF portal, it's the same construct. We're going to have the DNS configuration, where you're going to see the NIC with the reserved IP. And one thing that is interesting here, there is no like a record because the is specific for associated to the name, because the portal of the ADF, it's like is like a SaaS, right? Is a portal to manage, and that is not specific for the customers. And I believe we're going to cover that later because what is important to mention is that name is not be exclusive to you, because you can still able to resolve that name over the internet. And the goal here is just to make sure when you're inside your network, you're not going to go over the public internet and you're going to use the private endpoint. So it's a little bit different of the data factory, which is associated to the name of the data factory. This one is a little bit more open up. Nehali, do you have any comments on that?
No, good point. Yeah, so just to make sure, so there are two different private endpoints. One is for the portal, which is this one, the one that you are sharing. And then the other one is for the data factory control plane.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so now going back to the diagram, let me move back to my diagram. So we expose those private endpoints inside the hub virtual network. I already checked the virtual network link, at least for one of them, but for sure the other one is as well, is for the portal, is also linked to the hub. I already showed that the only configuration I did for my DNS private resolver is the inbound endpoint. And now, and I can even show now if, although I do have connectivity to reach out from on-premises any resources in Azure, I still need to do some configuration on my own premises in order to consume properly that data factory. One thing that we can do here, I can access this VM first and try to resolve both of the private endpoints that I just exposed. And we can see that because in Azure, because of the DNS link, we are going to be able to resolve that properly. But if I move to on-premises, we're going to have a different result, which is going to require us to do an extra configuration to that work properly. So what are we going to do is we're going to access this VM in the hub, and I'm going to show you, because this is already linked to the hub VNET, the VM in the Azure is going to be capable to resolve the new exposed ADF private endpoints. On the other hand, I'm going to show you later that the on-premise is not be capable because I need to do extra configuration, which I'm going to show you later, and how to make the on-premises to resolve the same private endpoints. So let me switch to the VM. So right now, I'm going to do the NS lookup for the Mauser West US3 data factory.azure.net. Keep in mind the data factory is always appended with the region name, so that's why I'm adding the West US3. And as you see right now, I'm capable to resolve the private IP of this private endpoint. Just for fun, if I, for example, I send the query to another DNS server, which is outside of Azure, like a public DNS, I'm going to get the public IP. But I just let you know, because right now my VM is consuming the, has the private link to the hub. It's capable to do that. The same thing is going to happen to the portal. In order to use the portal of the data factory, the name solution is a little bit different. It's adf.azure.com. And as you see, I'm getting the private IP 10.0.20.107. So right now in Azure, I'm covered. So because I do have those both zones linked to the hub, but if I move to the on-premises VM, just reconnect. Okay, I'm gonna try this exactly name resolution, and let's see what's gonna happen. I'm gonna do Mauser adf.west us3 dot data factory dot azure dot net. And as you see, I get exactly the public one. I'm not getting the private endpoint. because we require to have an extra configuration I'm going to show you to make the on-premise to work properly. And the same thing is going to happen for the ADF portal, which is nslookup adf.azure.com. I'm going to get the public endpoint. So the next step, going back to the diagram now, is, okay, I need to instruct my on-premises DNS server, which is this VM that I have running with Windows DNS. I need to do a configuration, which is a conditional forwarder, to instruct all my on-premises clients when they're trying to reach out data factory in the portal. They need to send that query. My on-premise DNS server is going to send the query to the inbound resolver IP. And when the query hits my resolver is sitting in the same VNet that's linked to the private DNS zone, and my on-premises is going to be capable to get the same private IP addresses. So now let's switch to the on-premises Windows DNS server that I have opened here already. Let me just reconnect. And I do have also the DNS console of my Windows already open. So when you open up the Windows DNS, you're going to have different types of configuration for what lookup zones, reverse lookup zones. And the one that we need to configure in this case is the conditional forwarders. What we have to do is just redirect any queries that is towards the data factory. For both the data factory zones, we need to redirect them to the Azure private resolver. So as you see here, previously in this lab, we do have for the blob core, which is pointing out to the inbound resolver. What we're going to do is create a new conditional forward zone to the ADF. So in this case, if you remember, we do have the our ADF, and we do have an explanation. We have to do the public domain name. We should not do the private link. I want to, and also Nehali, to add an extra link that I have in another article. If you do have bind-based DNS servers, you can technically do the conditional forwarders with the private link, but specifically for Windows, you have to use the original public domain name. So which in our case is going to be data factory .azure.net. And we need to type the IP of the DNS inbound resolver, inbound endpoint. So in this case, it's going to be the 10.20.164. So I'm going to go back to my DNS, 10.0.20.64. And that's it for the first zone. And the other zone that we're going to do is for the AFD portal. I'm going to do another one for afd.azure.com and to the same IP, 10.0.20.64.
You want to do ADF, right?
Oh, ADF. Thanks for that.
We love the front door for sure.
Oh, yeah. ADF. Thanks for catching up, Natalie. Okay, so now we do have both zones created, Data Factory Azure.net, the ADF.com. And if you investigate all of them, they have exactly the same inbound endpoint for the private resolver. And my VM should be capable now for on-premises. Send that query to this DNS service in on-premises as I showed you, and should follow the green flow hitting the inbound endpoint, private resolver sending to those linked VNets for ADF. Let me switch back to the client. Right, so I just configured the DNSs. Let me try to resolve the resolution for the Mauser ADF first. Looks like we have an issue. Okay, let's take a look and see potentially what is the error. Yeah, I'm getting back the public IP. Let me check my DNS. Oh, it looks like I missed 10.0.21.64. So it was a misconfiguration for my part on the DNS. Let me just update those. I'm going to go to the data factory properties. I'm going to just add the one here, 164. Okay. And I want to do the same for adfazure.com and adjust it for 164. So let me refresh. So now I have 164. Oh, let me click again. A small glitch. Click outside. I have 164. I have 164. What I'm going to do, I'm just do a quick clean cache of my DNS server. And let's return to the client. And I'm going to rerun the same command. And let's see if this time, oh, nice. Now we have the proper result.
Good
We do
catch.
have the 10.
Yeah.
Yeah, 10.0.21.06. And let's do the same for the ADF portal. I'm going to just rerun the DNS lookup. I'm going to do the adf.azure.com. And as you see, I'm getting the 10.0.21.07. So DNS integration has been working fine now. And with that, I just show you just a quick recap. On the DNS server, we had to do conditional forwarders, point to the proper inbound endpoint of the private resolver. And that's how we completed the name resolution from on-premises to Azure using the DNS private resolver to get those private IPs from the ADF. With that, I think that ends my part. One thing that I want to highlight before I finish my part, actually, for the hybrid connectivity, I know this labs covers VPN. The same idea applies for ExpressRoute. But later on this session, we're going to talk specifically for pointer sites. And I'm going to hand back to Nehali, and she's going to continue the ADF presentation. Back to you, Nehali.
Excellent, excellent presentation. Thank you, Daniel. That part is so important. So, all right. So let's move on to the next scenario, which is the one where we have the self-hosted integration runtime on-prem. And this is where DNS becomes very important. So it was good to get a primer from Daniel. So let's start this scenario by deploying the self-hosted integration runtime SHIR first. So let me bring you to the portal. And here I am in the data factory in integration runtimes under manage integration runtime. And if you remember from the first scenario, we already have the AutoResolve. So let's add the self-hosted integration runtime. So here you can select the first option. We can call it self-hosted, continue, and we'll call it SHIR on-prem. And we can use the same thing for description and create. So notice that here the portal experience is that it wants you to install this integration runtime. And there are two methods. We will be using this manual method. So in the interest of time, I've already downloaded the integration runtime for my on-prem demo. And so, but the keys are here. So let's just copy the key. and I'll show you what this MSI looks like first. And so what it looks like is you download this and then you run it and then just grab the key, and it comes to a point where it prompts you for a key, and just so you just paste the key in here. Okay, so I've pasted the key and I will then register. So this is what, if I go back to the portal, it's still showing not unavailable because we haven't installed it. So just to kind of give you the full picture, I am installing it right here, and it's trying to talk to the Azure Data Factory. So let's go back and just punch in, just hit register and see what happens. So finishing, this may take a few seconds. This green tick is just validating the key. So once it's initialized over here, we should see it available and is registered. So here you can launch the configuration manager here, or you could search for integration runtime, self-hosted integration runtime, and you can launch it. Next time you want to launch it, you can launch it manually from there. So let's do that. So we'll just launch the configuration manager. You can see that it's connected. So what just happened is that we connected it, but so far we haven't yet added the private endpoints. And this is an important call out that I want to make. And if we hit refresh over here, we are talking to the integration runtime is talking to the data factory control plane over the public endpoint. So let's look at that. So basically, I want to share a few flows that everything still is public. So you can access the data factory through public, you can access the portal through public, and of course the source and sink through public. But for this exercise, we want to project private endpoints for all of this. So let's do that. And the moment I project the private endpoint for the portal and the data factory, this communication that I just showed you, this blue flow will fail. Okay, so we'll take a look at that. So let's go ahead and project all the private endpoints, and I'll quickly run through this. Daniel already showed how to do all of that, so I'm going to quickly run through all of the private endpoint creation. And while the private endpoints are getting created, we'll jump back here and run through the flows. So let's go back to the portal. And one by one, we will just create, and I'll run through this very quick. So first we'll disable the private endpoint. And I want to make a distinction between this is specifically for self-hosted integration runtime to talk to the data factory. Okay, so the blue flow over here, this blue flow. So let's go back here and we'll do save here, and then we'll run through. Okay, so we'll quickly create the private endpoint. So we'll call it AD Data Factory PE. And here, just be sure that you pick the right region. If your data factory is in the different region than your private endpoint, in my case, the data factory is in East US, so it defaulted to East US. And then we'll pick data factory, just quickly run through this. Oops. And for DNS, you can see that it's showing me new, and I don't have any DNS set up. So I'll just open a new tab so that you can see before and after. Okay, so we'll quickly run through this and create. So it's going to start creating DNS zones. And so let's go to Data Factory, create the second one. So far, we just created these two endpoints, and we'll go ahead and create private endpoints for source and sink. So I'll go into my SQL server and we'll go to networking and we'll disable public access, save. And notice it says new. If you have an existing one, be sure to check the VNET link. If it's a new one, it will automatically create the link to the VNET that you have. Create. Okay, so and then we have the last one for the storage. So we go to networking. So this is our source, and we'll disable. All right, so now we have kicked off all the private endpoint creation, and we can hit refresh over here and you'll see all the different private DNS zones getting created. We're still waiting on the Azure, the blob.core for the storage. So while all of the private endpoints are getting created, let's go do a quick walkthrough of all the flows. So we are now ready to start doing the pipeline. But before we do the pipeline, what we have to ensure is that we can ensure the DNS bits. And before we do that, we have to ensure the routing. So let me first connect my point to site VPN, and looks like I am already connected. Point to site VPN connected. You can see that I have a DNS server over here. So what we will do is let's validate all of our DNS first. So first time I did this over point to site VPN and I tried to resolve it. Notice that I was getting a public IP. But if I resolve it with giving my DNS server, and again, my DNS server is the private DNS resolver, the inbound endpoint. When I do that, I was getting the private IP only if I put the DNS over here. So I'm specifically querying against that DNS. And so this is where I reached out to Daniel saying this, why is my NS lookup not working? And sure enough, Daniel had a perfect blog and an answer for me. So Daniel, I'll let you sort of help our audience through why this isn't working and what the solution is. And we'll share your blog link as well.
Yeah, so specifically for point to site, the way that we, there's two things we have to do, right, Nehali? I believe you need to instruct the VPN client in order to acquire the proper DNS server. I
Yeah,
think if you,
yeah,
in
this
your
one.
case, you have changed the XML of these Azure VPN client to accommodate the DNS server.
Yes.
And yeah, and there's another caveat, very important, is the way when any VPN tunneling connectivity over Windows, like VPN, it doesn't actually expose the DNS in the same way as the network interface card of the local NIC. So which means there is a specific functionality in Windows called network name resolution policy table, and that name resolution policy table, it's the way that Windows is going to commit that DNS entry from the VPN. However, there is another caveat that's very important. Any application that's on top of Windows is going to be capable to leverage that DNS. But if you try to run NS lookup, NS lookup is not capable to bring that information for. And I think you can run Nehali, that command get DNS client in RPT policy, and if you screw up, you're going to see the entry for the VPN. I think the first one you have in the namespace, that's the FQDN that we have. And any DNS that is specified over the configuration file, now this name resolution policy table, it's going to honor it. And any application on top of Windows is going to honor that DNS name resolution as well. However, NS lookup is not aware about it. The only way that you can test the name resolution, it's leveraging the PowerShell command resolve DNS name. So if
This
you,
one.
Nehali, yeah, exactly. So if you get the same name in resolve, and you're going to see that you don't need to specify any target DNS server, because in this case, this command is going to leverage the network resolution policy, the name resolution policy inside the VM and properly work. So which means if you have any other application opening the portal or including the integration runtime, they're going to be capable to honor that DNS entry.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much, Daniel.
You're
Yeah, I
welcome.
was just stuck with this, and it's exactly what was going on. So now everything is, as you could see, resolving to private, right? So this is a good starting point before you create any of the pipelines. Just validate that your DNS is indeed working correctly. So coming back to the flows, we just had all of the private endpoints projected, and we just validated that from on-prem. Everything resolves correctly, and for completeness, let's just make sure that all of our 4 new zones are created here. And now let's refresh this, and you can see that this one is also connected, and this one should show green as well, because it's using the private endpoint. Self-hosted integration runtime is using private endpoint to connect to the data factory control plane. Okay, so here you can see in the background as well that my integration runtimes are also showing the status of running, and this is the one in question, the one with the self-hosted integration runtime. Okay, so right there. And for completeness, Daniel mentioned this earlier, but Daniel, if you want to go over this XML file for the VPN
Yes.
configuration and this.
Definitely. Yeah, that's another important aspect when you're setting up the point to site to properly resolve the private link is to define that DNS server under the client settings. We do have that in the public documentation, that is actually entry. And if you see, we do have to define the DNS server entry, and that 172.16.21.4 in Nehali's scenario is either the DNS private resolver inbound endpoint, or if you have a custom DNS server that is going to be the VM NIC interface of your custom DNS server that's going to be capable to re-forward that request from the client to the private link, private DNS zone where you have the private links on. So that's very important. And just I want to add is obviously that's so you have to add this for each client. No, necessarily if you have like device management tools like Intune, you can customize that script and deploy this to all your point to site clients. But I just take that in account that you need to have that instruction inside the XML configuration file to take that. And I believe, Nehali, you have the Azure VPN client, and if you bring the screen, as soon as you add that entry, what's going to happen, and when you connect to Azure, it's going to show up the DNS entry there. I think if you maximize, we're going to, if you don't see that VPN DNS server, it's because it's not included in the XML file. So you have to go to the XML file, add those entries, re-import the client. Then when you reconnect it, it's going to show up as VPN DNS server as showing. So, which means at this point, everything now should be good to move forward and get the private link DNS resolved properly from the point site perspective. Back to you, Nehali.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel. And yes, mine is indeed in my case, this is indeed the private, inbound endpoint for the private DNS resolver. Excellent. All right, so lots of moving parts. Let's recap on what we have done so far. And okay, so far what we did was we projected all of these private endpoints. We kicked off VPN, point-to-site VPN. In my case, my private connectivity is using the point-to-site VPN. So point-to-site VPN, we have, like Daniel mentioned, the DNS config here. And then there is another important point that I want to call out, that if you had site-to-site VPN and you were configuring a DNS server over here, like kind of continuation to what Daniel shared in the deep dive part, I want to call out this particular, maybe Daniel, you can talk through this one, the difference between this forward lookup zone and the conditional forwarder. I often see customers kind of misconfigure that part.
That's correct, Nehali. That's a really important point to pay attention. So the forward lookup zone are zones that are authoritative of the DNS. So it's very important that you don't add the Azure owned, in our case, it's going to be Data Factory, the domain zone, Data Factory Azure.net, as well as the ADF Azure.com zones. It's very important not to add to forward lookup zone, because if you add to that level, you become authoritative, which means it's like you owning the zone, which is not true. So you have to pay attention that you need to add at the bottom as a conditional forwarder, because what the intention here is to get the traffic from the on-premise DNS server or custom DNS server that you have and forward that request to the private DNS resolver. And if you by accident you do that, you can cause a big issue in your environment, and pretty much you can stop all access to all those related paths. So just pay attention for the lookup zone. Avoid to do that. Just move towards the conditional forwarders. Make sense, Nahali?
Yeah, perfect. Great point as well. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, and so so far we had the point to site. In Daniel's example, we had site to site, and then this is showing our private DNS resolver, the 21.4 that I was using for the P2S. And then there is an important call out I want to make in this flow, that with Data Factory, there are two private endpoints, Portal and Data Factory. This is for the users to access the actual Data Factory studio, adf.azure.com. It's going to be reachable both over public and private. And to control the public access, you would have to use other methods like conditional access. But out of the box, like Daniel mentioned earlier, this would both work because this is a SaaS offering, a multi-tenant. And then the other important, this blue flow, is if you remember when we were creating the private endpoint, it mentioned that this private endpoint is for self-hosted integration runtime to Data Factory. So this blue flow, notice the difference between the green and the blue. The blue goes from the integration runtime to the Data Factory control plane. Okay, so that first time when I did it, that was a little confusing for me. So I want to make sure I share that piece. And then the last part is going to be the orange flows. So we haven't got to this point yet. We haven't set up our pipelines, but just kind of showing all the flows. The orange ones are from self-hosted integration runtime to the source and the sink. Lots of moving parts. Daniel, anything else I missed here?
I think you covered it very well, Nahali.
Okay, thank you. And last but not the least, the source could very well be on-prem. And of course, the SHIR is on-prem, the source would be local, so routing for that is not an issue. But this is a classic use case for it. So you know, it's important that I call out that the source could very well be here. In my case, the source and sink are both private endpoints. Okay. So a lot of moving parts, lots of flows. So one of the things that I do in these videos is I want to use this also as a kind of a recording of my lab, like a working state of my lab. So I will now move on to what I call validations and troubleshooting section, and we'll quickly just jump through all of the sections in the portal and just validate that everything looks good, and then we will run the pipeline. Okay, so let's quickly go in the portal. And I will work my way. We'll start with the Data Factory and we'll work our way all the way to the source and the sink. So in the Data Factory, you want to look at the network setting, make sure that your both private endpoints look healthy and that the network access is private endpoint. Then we go to the hub VNet. This is where, you know, you can see that my links to all of the private DNS zones look healthy. And then we will go to private DNS zones. I have 4 of them. And then we'll just click through one of them to make sure that, the virtual network link and the record sets look healthy. And oops, sorry. So just capturing the healthy state of my lab here. And then we'll go in the data factory itself. In the data factory, there are 2 observations to make. You go to the integration runtime, look and make sure everything is running over here. And then we will go to the SQL Server. Let's look at, there are 2 screens that I want to capture. One is the networking public access is disabled, and we have a private endpoint. And sometimes I have seen that if something isn't quite working, you have errors, just make sure your Entra ID is set up correctly. And on the SQL database side, I wanted to show the compute. Sometimes, let me open a new tab. I don't want to lose the screen. Sometimes, and this is a new feature, I realize that your databases might get paused, and that setting is under enable auto pause. So if this is out of the box, so make sure if your databases get paused and you're doing a lab, or you can check that setting. And last but not the least, we can capture our networking for the storage account, public disabled, and then private endpoints. Anything, Daniel, I missed in the portal validation that you want to call out?
I think you covered very well, Nahali. No observations here.
Okay, cool. And then one last bit so that we have all of our state in a good condition is make sure that once you have your point to site VPN going, right? So if you once you have the point to site VPN going, make sure you validate routing first. So I have done, do I have my oh, you can ping, you can, so that is just testing just a ping to something in Azure, a VM in Azure, and then make sure that you can reach port 53. So routing should be intact, and then like we did earlier, just make sure all of your source sync data factory and adf.azure.com. All of that is healthy. So that is on the DNS side. Now you might ask, all that is good, but we are network engineers. We don't believe that this is working until we see the packet captures, right? Daniel, PCAP it or it didn't happen. So we can then do this. How do I know that this is indeed working and it is working with private endpoints? So what I have done, just to kind of make it complete, is I have a Wireshark capture over here. And what we will do is we will stop this integration runtime. Okay, so then we can see this end to end. And so let's stop this service. Let's stop this capture. Start Wireshark again. Okay. And I am only capturing for the handshake type so that we can see the SNI header. So I'm going to go ahead and start the service and see what this integration runtime is talking to. So you could see here that it is indeed talking to the data factory private endpoint. Let me make this a little bit better so you could see the full screen here. So it's not yet connected, but you could see that it is indeed talking to the private IP as soon as I start the service, and it does take a few seconds, so we'll pause the video here, but And you can see that because I stopped the service, it is, oh, now it's running. And now we could go back and in here see our Wireshark. Oh, that is connected. Now it's showing as connected, and you can see that it is indeed using the private endpoint. So far, the only flow of interest. Daniel, I see you gave me a thumbs up. So this is the blue flow. It's indeed using the private endpoint. So awesome. So now that we have done all these validations, we can run the pipeline. But be sure to check if all of these things are set up correctly before you run the pipeline, so that we are successful. So let me bring up the pipeline now. And setting up the pipeline would be easy today because we've already set up if you remember from our previous scenario, we already have the pipeline. So I have the pipeline source and sink. If you remember, we ran the commands. So let's just make sure that our sink doesn't have anything. So we're going to empty the table. So let's see, is there anything? Yeah, so the table does have something, so we'll empty the table. I believe this is the right command. Okay, so now if we run it, we have 0 rows, right? So after we trigger the pipeline, this should get populated. Now the question is, how do we make this pipeline so that it uses the private endpoints? So for that, the change is very simple. So what we do is we go into the linked services. So if you remember from the previous video, the previous scenario, we created these linked services. And notice how the integration runtime that we are using is AutoResolve. So now we can use the self-hosted integration runtime. And then we should remember to test the connection. Oh, it's asking for, so we'll just use the subscription. So remember, we're using this self-hosted integration runtime that is using all the private endpoints. And if we test the connection, this should be successful. Okay, so our connection is successful, and so we'll go ahead and apply. And we'll do the same thing for the SQL. We'll change the integration runtime to self-hosted. And I think we still, again, need to put the password and then run test connection. Okay, connection is successful, and we'll go ahead and apply. So now that our linked services are using the private endpoints, we'll go to let's take a quick look at the data sets. So these are our source and sink data sets. So if you see if you edit this, and this is the connection between the data set, and you can see that it's now using the SHIR on-prem. Okay, so now we can test this connection as well if you want. Okay, the connection is successful. We can preview the data. There is nothing in it because we haven't run the pipeline. And we can go test this connection. Right, so, okay, so that connection is successful. Let's preview the data real quick. And so this is the source. So we have the data in the source. So let's go ahead and run the pipeline now that we have everything connected with private endpoint. Ideally, you would want to create a trigger. I'm still running it in debug mode, but in production, that's how it's designed to work. But this debug mode is handy when we are troubleshooting any network connectivity. Okay, so our pipeline did run successfully. So let's go and validate that we indeed have the data. Remember it, we had cleaned up the table, and now if we run it again, we should see the data, the pipeline running successfully. So now let's run this pipeline again with the Wireshark. And before I do that, I'm going to clear this table. So I have a query saved that would clear this. So we just deleted it, and let's just make sure there is nothing in the sink in the destination. Perfect. So now what I will do is let's capture. We'll clear our capture. We'll start our capture again. And then we will kick off the pipeline again, and we'll watch the Wireshark capture. Nothing like watching Wireshark captures. So here we will see different SNI headers. We expect to see storage at some point, and then, oh, there's storage, and then we expect to see the sink, which is the SQL server. Looks like our pipeline did succeed. Did I miss it, or?
Yeah, maybe it's because the SQL is the TDS. I don't know if it's going to show as the. You see, there is a couple entries for TDS. TDS usually is SQL.
Which
On
one?
the TDS, as you see in the protocol, there is TLS 1, 2, but the TDS this is SQL. But I don't know if you're
Good.
going to see. You see that is in the database on the text on the right side on the.
Yes, good
Yeah, I don't know if
point.
you can break down that as. I think if you expand data, if it's on the bottom, on the left, if you expand data, I don't know if that is an entry for the name. Expand data. Expand that one.
But we
No,
can
but
see,
yeah,
no,
you can. Yeah, it's
you can
because
see it there.
TDS.
Good
Yeah,
point. Yeah,
yep.
awesome. So this is working through all of it through the private endpoint. So anything else, Daniel? I think that completes all my layers for this scenario. Let me check my notes, unless you think there is anything else to call out here.
No, I think you did very well. I wasn't expecting the Wireshark portion.
Just for you, Daniel. It's just for
It's
you.
great for networking. Yeah, for troubleshooting, definitely. I think you cover all the aspects from provisioning, standpoint, to give an overview in the troubleshooting. Yeah, that's awesome.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so let's now do the self-hosted integration runtime, except that this time we will do it on a VM in Azure. And this layer should be very quick because the underlying concepts are the same. So if you remember from the big picture, the placement of the integration runtime is going to be here. In the previous scenario, it was on-prem. Okay, so since we have created a lot of the private endpoints, let me just walk you first through the architecture, and then we'll jump on the VM and in the portal. So here, the idea is that the integration runtime is running on a VM in Azure. And so we will first create it. So let's go ahead and create it, because it may take a few minutes to create. So we'll take some time. So we'll go here and we'll do the same thing, except this time we will call it in Azure VM. So we'll say new self-hosted, continue. So it's exactly the same. Okay, and so the workflow is exactly the same. So I will close this over here, and let's finish our layers here. And so what will happen is we haven't yet projected the private endpoint. So even with the self-hosted integration runtime in Azure, you can still access the data factory control plane publicly, and same goes for sync. So it will continue to work with public, but let's see how to make it work with private endpoints. So let's project the private endpoint for source and sync, which we already did it in the previous scenario, and then we will project the private endpoints for the data factory. Notice it's the data factory, the control plane. So blue is control plane. And then the flows, so on-prem user would be able to access this privately as well as publicly, but private will be available. And the integration runtime will talk to the data factory control plane privately. Okay, so given all of these endpoints are in place, all of the private endpoints, all we need to now do is just install the IR over here. Anything I missed, Daniel? I'm going to try to jump onto my VM.
It's all good, Nahali.
Okay, perfect. So here I am. I always like to run this command first. So just to give you guys oriented, I'm on a VM in Azure. This is my IP, and I have saved all the commands so we can quickly just run through it. The first thing we will do, like I mentioned, we'll just make sure that our IP config and that all of these resolve properly. So now that Daniel has shown us this fantastic command, we will just use this one and make sure that everything resolves to private from this integration runtime. So that's the first thing. And then I got this VM to a point where, let's see if it's still at a point where we just have to punch in the key. So we'll perfect. Yep. So I kicked off the install, and in the interest of time, I left it at a point where all we have to do is, but of course in my download, I do have the integration runtime. So I did kick off this and left it at this point. So let's grab the key. And for that, we have to jump on the portal. And you could see that the Azure VM is still not working because we haven't punched in the key. So we'll grab the key, go to the Azure VM, we'll punch the key in here, and we'll say register. This may take a few seconds. Okay, so it took a little bit of time. We paused the video and you can see that it is completed. So let's just launch this and you can see that it is connected. We will go and look at it in the portal. And now if we refresh the screen here, all this one is running as well. Okay, so now that what we just tested, and just for the completeness, is this blue flow. So integration runtime can talk to the data factory using the private endpoint, and of course us as users can use it privately as well, or publicly. And so now let's go ahead and kick off the pipeline. And for that, it's a very small change that we have to do. And that's in the linked services. And we will do the exact same exercise here. We will use the self-hosted Azure VM. And we will test this. Hopefully it goes faster this time. Okay, so connection was successful. We apply it to the storage, and we'll go and we'll test the connection here. So it's very similar to the previous scenario, so we'll go through this quick. And now let's go to our pipeline. Of course, you can validate the data set exactly like we were using this test connection, and then preview the data. There shouldn't be anything in there. And then likewise test and preview. And that reminds me, let's clear this table as well. So we'll just, okay, so we'll run to see there is data, and then we'll delete it, we'll verify there's nothing. Okay, so now we are ready to run the pipeline, but before that, you can validate these connections for the data sets over here, and then let's kick off the pipeline. Here, if I run the pipeline, well, you could see that the source and the sink is already good to go, and we'll run the pipeline. Of course, now I'm in the VM in Azure. I don't have Wireshark running there. But the same concept applies over there as well. Okay, so the pipeline was successful, and let's go back and test this. And there we have our data in the destination. So Daniel, that completes our, I had one more layer. So DNS is, of course, kind of always going to be at play. I do have, wherever my integration runtime is, I do have my data factory storage, all of those private DNS zones linked over here. So I have a VNet link to the private DNS zones.
It looks great.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so let me just, for completeness, I'll just put this here. So these are all the private DNS zones. So now let's go to our next scenario, which is the managed VNet. So if you see, the integration runtime is in a fully managed VNet, and the use case for this, right? So if we look at our use cases from before, this is important to call out. We covered this in the concepts, but if you look at the middle row here, where you can see that this gives you, of course, it's a managed compute. So in addition to it being a managed compute and auto scaling capabilities, if you strictly look at it from the network perspective, you can have private endpoints. So your source and sink could be private endpoint, and your on-prem data center can still access the portal using private endpoints. Okay, so that's the main use case. So let's go through all the flows and how this is designed to work. So this is a fully managed VNet. So the question comes up: how do we use private endpoints with it, right? So the way you would do private endpoints is we will project these private endpoints into the managed VNet. So let's go ahead. And so my next layer is to create the integration runtime. So let's first do that. It does take a few minutes, so we'll kick off the integration runtime creation. And it's the exact same place that we were before. So far, 3 scenarios, 3 integration runtime. So this is our last scenario. We'll go ahead and create the integration runtime, and we'll pick Azure this time, not the self-hosted. So this is Azure managed. It says fully managed. So we'll pick that, and we will call it managed VNet IR. So first time I did it, I completely missed this tab over here. So what makes it, and I went ahead and I just assumed that because, when it said Azure, I just assumed that it was going to create managed VNet, but this is the part that I want to call out. Oops, sorry, it deleted that you have to go in this tab and enable it. Okay, so that's what makes it managed VNet. So we'll go ahead and we'll hit create. So this may take a little bit, so we'll wait. While we wait, we'll go jump back into the flows and the design. So here we just created the integration runtime, and I can't remember why I have this layer, but let's take a look. Okay, I'm just calling out that the tab that I missed, and then it may take up to 15 minutes to get ready. So I just kicked off the installation. So let's look at all of the source, sink, and the flows. So here we can disable inbound to the PaaS or limit it with the PaaS firewall services. And then the control plane connection from integration runtime to the data factory does happen behind the scenes. And then we will project, and this is the key point, we will project these two private endpoints in the managed VNet. And then actually that's just about it. And then we can access it publicly, the ADF Studio, or if we project the private endpoints, we can access it privately. Okay, so the blue flow is the integration runtime, the control plane flow, and these two stay the same. Okay, and optionally, you can also have, let's say you had an AKS cluster with a load balancer. You can also project any other private endpoints that you want over here. But for us, for now, we're just showing these two. But given, with PLS, you can use the load balancer and AKS. I worked with a customer with this use case, so I just have that over here. Anything, Daniel, on this architecture? I think this is pretty complete here.
It's pretty straightforward, Nahali.
Yeah, perfect. So with that, let me go ahead and kick off these. So the most important workflow here is how do we go about doing this private endpoint. So for that, you would want to go in the Azure Data Factory Studio. And here you will see that you have managed private endpoints. So you will go ahead and say create private endpoints, and then we'll do one for storage. And we'll call it storage PEP. And we'll select our storage account. And we'll say create. And we'll also create one for our SQL. Okay. And we'll call this create. Now here there is an important call out that I want to make, that it's showing provisioning, and if we jump back on the SQL Server side, we should see the corresponding private endpoint request making it over here. So it says pending because we need to approve this. Okay, and likewise in the storage, if we go to networking and we hit refresh, it's also pending. Okay, so this is the private endpoints that are getting projected over here, and we just, because it's from Azure managed or Microsoft managed VNet, we need to approve, and this is going to, customer has to approve it for it to work. So let's go ahead and approve it. So we'll click here, approve. So we'll say approved by, and then we'll just say this, and then we'll just go in the other one, and we'll go here, say approve. So there, we now have the two endpoints approved, and let's just refresh this, approved, and then refresh this. This is also approved, and then here they both should show healthy. So this does take a time. So we'll pause the video here. So we paused the recording, and now you can see that the managed private endpoints provisioning is succeeded, and it's in an approved state. Okay. So now let me also show you the integration runtimes. So we now have all four, and the second one is the one in question, the managed VNet. Before that, we did the Azure VM. So to run the pipeline, let's switch the setting on the linked services. So we'll go to the blob storage. We still have the SHIR, the self-hosted integration runtime, the Azure VM one. So we'll switch it to managed VNet, and then we will, let me just finish the rest of the information, my storage account. And here, one thing to notice is that notice that the test connection button is grayed out, and it talks about enabling it using interactive authoring. And if you hover over this if you hover over this interactive authoring information bubble, you can actually click on the link to enable it. So I'll go ahead and enable it just to show you the experience. It does take a few seconds, so we may have to pause the video. So we paused the video, and it took a few minutes. I think it says that it may take up to 2 minutes. So we paused the video. It's enabled now, and now you can see that the test connection button is lighted up. So we'll hit test connection. Okay, so we see that the connection is successful. We'll hit apply. And here, let's move on to we'll do the same thing here. And because we already enabled the interactive authoring, here it's already showing up as lighted up, and then we can hit test connection. So test connection was successful. We hit apply. So now let's take a quick look at our data sources. So we'll look at data sources, making sure that we are mapped to over here. You could see that we are mapped to the managed VNet integration runtime. And if you hit edit, you can also see that we are in the managed VNet. Okay, so this is in the data sets, same way in the integration runtime is managed VNet, and you can hit test connection here if you want, and you could also hit test connection here. But we validated that already, so let's go ahead and run the pipeline. And before I run the pipeline, let me make sure that I deleted the rows and that there is nothing in our table. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run the pipeline. This may take a few seconds. Okay, looks like our pipeline has succeeded. So let's go see. Let's go run this query again, and now it is populated. Okay, so the pipeline ran successfully. And so jumping back to the diagram, what we just did is we had these two sources, source and sink, and we associated that with this integration runtime and ran the pipeline. And of course, I am VPN'd in and accessing the data factory using the private IP. If you don't want to run Wireshark, you can also do a quick trick here with the dev tools. So if you run the developer tools and if you do adf.azure.com, and you can see that we are hitting the ADF portal. And if I stop, you could see here that I am at adf.azure.com. I'm hitting it on using the private IP. And if you were directly watching this scenario before, we made sure that we were VPN'd in and that we have the DNS set up correctly, and this 21.4 is nothing but the IP of the private DNS resolver that I have set up for my as an inbound IP. So just for completeness. So now we will go to my next layer here, which is talking about a scenario where if you did have something other than the source and sink, something that is with the private link service. So I had a customer, as I mentioned before, with AKS, so you could also use a load balancer, PLS, and project that into this managed VNet. And last but not the least is an important scenario where you might ask, how does this integration runtime reach a source that is on-prem? Okay, so let me light up that layer. And it's also the scenario that is in the comparison for different integration runtime, how to pick which one. And you can see here, this talks about on-prem data access, and that's the scenario we're going to talk about. So let me light up, we have an official, very well documented scenario here. And Daniel, I think you've done this with a customer, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct, Nehali.
Yeah.
In this approach to reach out, in this example, a SQL server that's sitting on premises, it's required to expose that SQL server through a private link service that's sitting in the forwarding virtual network. And what this private link service does, it gives the capability to attach a network interface in the managed network, virtual ADF managed network. And with that, what happens is ADF is going to see that SQL Server is exactly as belonging to that network with the IP within the managed network. That traffic is going to get forwarded to the private link service. That private link service is sitting on top of what you see in the diagram, PLS, private link service subnet, which means it's going to take like a source IP that belongs to that subnet automatically and forward that request to a load balancer. And from that load balancer, you require to have some sort of like NVA. In the official documentation, they use Linux VMs with IP tables, where we add some forwarding rules to anything that goes towards that, it's received towards that port, it's going to get forwarded to on premises. And so that's the approach that we have today. But obviously, there is some improvements on the works in order to eliminate that requirement of the load balance and the NVA and have the private link services reaching directly to the on-premises. So just stay tuned that as soon as we have this functionality, it's going to be publishing the Azure updates on the networking. But that's the approach, Nehali. Should they support it, you require to have that NVA in order to forward the traffic from Azure to on-premises and hit the destination target, which is the SQL Server.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, and of course, the pros and cons. I mean, this would be the two VMs that you have to manage, the customer has to manage. So still requires some extra configuration and orchestration. And here, if you click on this diagram, I do have a link directly to the documentation that talks about it. So thank you, Daniel, for going over
Yep.
the details.
I just want to add, Nehali, if the customer, usually most of the customers, they have some sort of like a third-party NVA already, like a Palo Alto, a FortiGate, a Firewall, Checkpoint. They can technically reuse that same, instead of adding those new dedicated Linux VMs, they can technically, because those solutions, they're going to have high availability, a load balance in front of them, and they just need to attach the private link service, and with that, they can technically accomplish the same.
Oh, that's a great, yeah, that's a great scenario. And so you're saying essentially any NVA that they have third-party NVAs instead of using a Linux-based VMs.
Yeah, technically they can leverage the same to do about the same thing as you see on this diagram.
Okay, yeah, great call out. Thanks, Daniel. And so that brings us, let me check my notes real quick, but that brings us to the end of this scenario, Daniel, in case I missed anything. I know a lot of moving parts here.
Well, I think you did a great job. And yeah, just this kind consideration when you're reaching out on premises on the managed VNET option, that you need this extra component in terms of taking consideration that in order to reach out that on premises. Other than that, everything looks great.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so I was just checking my notes. I had one little thing that I want to show you real quick. So if you go to the data factory, and I haven't played with this, but there is something about outbound rules. So let me close this here. So you could technically enable outbound rule policy to restrict outbound endpoints. So just wanted to call out everything that we saw so far was going to the private endpoints. So you can restrict that as well. Right. So with that, let's move on to our next scenario, which is Fabric, Azure Data Factory inside Fabric. So let me. So I want to talk a little bit about Azure Data Factory versus Fabric Data Factory. And I do have a sort of a comparison over here. But as you know, Fabric is Microsoft is investing heavily over there, and it's an unified platform. So you can use just one platform for a lot of your data engineering projects, right? So that's the go forward direction. However, the Data Factory, Azure Data Factory has been there for a long time. So there are some features that are still not available in Fabric. So you may want to check that and decide. So I've listed a few pros and cons, or which scenario you can use Data Factory versus Azure Data Factory versus Fabric Data Factory, right? So what I would show you is how the networking works for the Fabric Data Factory. And we'll also show you that unified experience. You'll see that when we build the pipeline, it just kind of has a different experience, but under the hood, it's doing a lot of the things that are similar. So with that, let me light up the next layer. Here I have also put some architectures here. So if you light up the architecture layer, I picked some from a Microsoft documentation, the ones I thought were useful. So you can click on those to navigate that. And then let's look at first the control plane. Just like the data factory, you can use app.fabric.com to hit the Microsoft Fabric. But let's start looking at the source and the sink. I think this was coming out a little bit light in the recording, so I want to make sure. Okay, sorry about that. So here you could still hit the source and sink publicly. Of course, like Daniel mentioned before, it would still be through the Microsoft backbone. And then you can also project the source and sink here, but how would Data Factory reach this? And that's what I'm going to demo. So we'll hide the public controls and we'll figure out how does the Data Factory connect into the Azure VNet. So there is a service in Fabric called Power Platform VNet Service. Essentially under the hood, so I've kind of drawn it in the middle over here, and under the hood it spins up a little container. So you do have to give it a subnet and it will spin up a container for the VNet gateway. And what that enables us to do is what will happen is we can disable inbound access to public access to our PaaS services, and we can traverse this through this link to hit the private endpoints. And then we can run the Data Factory pipeline. Okay, so as you know, in the previous scenarios, we already projected these private endpoints in this subnet. So all we have to do is go in the Data Factory, create this VNet gateway, and create this container in this VNet. Okay, so I'll show you how to do that. Daniel, any question on the architecture so far before we jump in the, or I missed anything here?
Yes, it's a delegated subnet, right, for Fabric, where we're going to have this container inside the
Yes, good point.
Okay.
Let me pull up the documentation first that talks about the requirements, and then I'll show you the delegation in the portal as well. So here, this is the documentation. It's in the Power Platform. So you have to register the Power Platform as a resource provider. So that's number one. And then you have to associate the subnet with Power Platform, and that's where the delegation happens. So let me show you that in the VNet and the subnet in question. So I've already created this gateway in the subnet called Power BI Gateway subnet. And if you look, we should see that, yeah. So this is the delegation, the VNet access links. And we'll put the link in the description below as well. Make sense?
That makes sense. Thanks, Nahali.
Yep. So now that we have this, we will the Power Platform VNet service. We can, in terms of the flow, strictly from the routing perspective, we can hit these private endpoints. So let's go and look at the gateway deployment in Azure. And this is the official diagram. The way they show it is that any of the Power BI or Power Platform resources can hit the Azure, can reach the Azure VNet through this Power Platform VNet service. So to do that, what you have to do is we'll go to the Fabric portal. So it's app.fabric.microsoft.com. And you would go under this, you click this gear icon, and all the wonderful networking stuff is under Manage Connections and Gateways. Okay, so there is a Connections tab. You can also deploy on-premises data gateways. And then this is the one that we have created the virtual network data gateway. So let me show, I've already, in the interest of time, I've already created it, and you can see that it is associated with the Power BI subnet. And let me show you the experience. It does take a few minutes, so I'll just show you what it looks like. So we'll go and click this. We'll hit the subscription. We'll pick the resource group, pick the hub VNet, and you can see that only the Power BI gateway subnet is lighted up because that's the only one that has the delegation set up. So if it doesn't, if nothing lights up, that means that you haven't done the delegation yet. So that's the first step. And then once you do that, it does say that there is a duplicate gateway name, so we'll call it 2. And then we can hit, once you finish this, you can hit save. But I already have one created, but just wanted to show you the experience. Any question here, Daniel, or anything I
No,
missed?
actually, I was just looking over the advanced options and reading high availability. You can define also the number of instances, right?
Yes, yes, you can define the number of instances, and that actually brings up a good point because that defines, like if you make your gateway subnet too small or too big, I think you can go up to 7. And here it talks a little bit about how do you slice your, if you want more scaling, then you want to make sure that your subnet is carved up properly. And notice I did want to show you this because first time I did it, I did have to reach out to a Fabric expert. So I'll share that a bit with the audience. But right now I'm using the trial license. But there are certain features that you have to use the Fabric capacity. So everything I demoed today was done using, that I'll demo today will be done using the trial license. But if you needed some other features, you would have to enable the Fabric capacity. I've suspended it for now, so it doesn't drain my credits, but that's the experience of deploying the gateway. And it does have the inactivity timeout of 30 minutes. So if it doesn't show online, you can just hit this refresh button and then that should be okay. And so let me show you my license real quick. I believe that's so it's actually in the workspace. You can see that my license is trial. Okay. And if you did want to set up um, the capacity, you can go in here. Once your capacity is enabled, you'll be able to pick Fabric capacity. Certain advanced features does require that. But I was able to test all networking using trial. All right. So now that we have the data gateway enabled, let's go back in here and look at this one more time so we can refresh this, make sure this is online. And then in terms of running the pipeline, there are two workflows. One is you can create the connections manually, like we did it in the data factory. So here you can create a connection. You can create a connection to on-premises, and that's the time you can pick your on-premises gateway if you had created one. In our case, we will pick the virtual network, and we'll pick the virtual network gateway that we just created, or I just showed you. And then you can call this, let's say, storage connection, and then we can pick the connection type to be Azure Storage Blob, something like this. Okay, and then hit create over, fill out all of this information and hit create. Essentially what we're doing is going back to the drawing board. We are creating this connection. Okay, so the private endpoint already exists. We are just creating the FQD, putting the FQDN and creating the connection over the VNet. It will hit the private endpoint. But we wouldn't do it this way. I'll show you a different workflow. But notice how there is no connections over here. After we create the workflow or the pipeline using the native workflow, you'll see the connection will show up over here. So I'll remember to show you after as well. So the way you will create a data factory pipeline in Fabric, again, note that we're still in the Fabric portal. And I did create, so you can go to workspaces and there is a new workspace button over here that you can click and create a new workspace. I've already created a workspace called NNADF workspace. What we'll do is we'll create a new item and we'll search for pipeline. So we'll create the data pipeline, and this is that unified experience that we're talking about with Data Factory. So we can call it Fabric Data Factory Pipeline. And here the experience is that once you create this, it will walk us through what we need to do next. Right, so we start with a blank canvas. We can start there or start with guidance. So we'll use the start with guidance. Here, the experience is that it will prompt you for the source. So we'll pick a source and it is asking for the account name. So here we just need to put the account name, and it's giving you an example, and then it will populate the rest for you, and we'll create a new connection. We'll create the Power BI. We'll use the gateway that we just created, the VNET gateway, and then we'll use the account key and we'll use this, and then we'll go next. And you can see it showing us the column mapping. It does a good job because we have a very simple table. Of course, you can do more transformations here. But there it gives you a nice visual of what we're doing, taking a CSV and putting it in the database. So we'll hit save and run. And it's running the pipeline. Overall, the experience is better, but the underlying constructs are the same. Okay, so now the pipeline has succeeded, as you can see over here. And I want to show you, just to validate here, we will run this again. Not sure why it's showing 0 rows. It is still showing 0 rows. So let's troubleshoot. Not sure what we missed there. So we're going to go back into the fabric, something we must have missed in the overall flow here. So let's look at the source. Looks good. Destination. Here, it looks like there. I think this is the table. That doesn't look right. So we should change it to the right table. I bet you that's the issue. Let's run, save and run. The pipeline again should resolve the issue. Okay, so now it succeeded. And let's run it again. Okay, there we have the rows populated now. So one of the things that I want to share here is, remember I mentioned at the beginning about the connections. So let's go and see what happens, how the connections look now. So we'll go under the settings, connections, and you'll notice that the two connections that we created through that full experience are now showing up here. Okay, so you can either manually create it here, or if you connect through the pipeline workflow, it will show up over here. And you can quickly check the status over here by refreshing it here and refreshing it here. And Daniel, you had brought up this point earlier about the test connection button. So let me show you that one. The one for test connection does show up over here. So let's call this storage connection, and we'll pick up blob storage. And there, I think that there's no explicit test connection button, but under the hood it does do that. And you, if it's your source is not ready, you could skip it and then just at least have it functionally overpopulated here. Make sense?
Makes sense. Thanks for explaining.
Yeah, perfect. So this is all good here. So let me discard the changes and let's go back to our draw.io. Yeah, I did want to show you one thing where we missed that table. So in our workflow, when we were putting the destination, it defaulted to the sales dash sample. And this is where if we had picked the right table the first time, it would have worked. But instead, the way we ended up fixing it is we just kind of fixed it in the pipeline. Okay, so we just ended up fixing it here directly over here. So let's continue with our layers. So let's go back to the drawing board here. And what we just did is we already had projected these private endpoints, and then we ran a pipeline that worked over this Power Platform VNET service. Okay, and kind of remember that there is a lot of the requirements over here that I wanted to make sure that you look at all the requirements for the virtual network data gateways, including the resource provider registration, subnet delegation, the sizing of the subnet. There's also a little bit of note about licensing and regions that are supported. So I did read about the licensing. I was able to use the trial license, but officially we are recommending these other licensing if you want to use the virtual network gateway. So be sure to check out this link. We'll put it in the description. Anything else I missed? I have one more layer, Daniel, after this, but want to make sure we cover this, we complete this one.
I think you did great. I think you cover what I need from the data factory perspective.
Perfect. Thank you, Daniel. And then last flow here is, notice that, and this comes up often, that notice that we use the VNET Power Platform to do the integration with Azure VNet. And there is also the concept of managed VNet in Fabric. Uh, just like Azure Data Factory, there is a managed VNet concept in Fabric, and you can project these private endpoint in that managed VNet. So let's go see where this is in the portal, and then we will look at the limitations or what is currently supported. So if you go to the Azure Azure Fabric, so app.fabric.com, and again we will go under. We'll first go to the workspace, and then we'll go under workspace and outbound networking. And here it allows us to create managed private endpoint. Remember this, these are projected in the managed VNet, not in the customer's VNet. So let's go through one of these workflows, and we'll call this storage PE. And we have to give the full storage resource identifier. I already have that populated, and we'll call this blob storage, and then we'll say requesting approval, and then we'll just sign our initials for now so we know it's coming from us. And so this is requesting approval. So we'll create one private endpoint for storage, and we will create another private endpoint for SQL. Okay, just want to make sure I'm using the right resource. That's the storage account. And let's pick this, and we'll say requesting approval. Okay, so here you could see that it's still waiting on provisioning. So very similar to what we did with Azure Data Factory. We'll go to the networking tab over here, and we'll see that it's waiting on approval, requesting approval here, and we'll just approve it. Okay, so that's the approved from the SQL side. And likewise on the storage, we could go to private endpoints, and there should be one that is waiting on pending approval, and we'll approve it. Okay, approved from storage side. Yeah. And let's go back in here. It may take a few seconds to sync, but if we go up here, this is where that integration with managed VNet happens. So essentially what we just did was we just projected these in the managed VNet. So you might ask, just like how these flows were working to this private endpoint, right? Can the data factory use this private endpoints that are in the managed VNet? So as far as I have done the research and testing, what I have found so far, and again, this is the official documentation. We just projected this too, and in this case, this is the storage. So what it talks about over here is that there are certain workloads that are supported today, and the workloads are listed, and I do have a link to where these supported items are listed. And there is a question, specific question over here, that is it possible to connect existing private endpoints in Data Factory? So it is saying that presently only using the virtual network gateway, the data gateway that we created. Okay. So this is how today it is supported using the, oops, this orange flows using the virtual network data gateway. But since this is an evolving product, we will be doing a Fabric video a little bit later in the series. So if that does, whenever that is supported, we'll do an update over there. Does that make sense, Daniel? Anything else I missed?
Makes sense. I have a question.
Sure.
How about data sources on premises on this scenario with Fabric?
That's a great question. So for that, what would happen, and I haven't tested it, but we could use this construct. So kind of going back to on-premises gateway.
On-prem
So
data
we
gathers.
could so we could use that and then connect. And this on-premises is a little, it could run on Azure VM as well, as far as I remember running into this with another customer, and you can install that in a VM in Azure as well. So from there you could connect to other endpoints as well.
Private traffic, that application is still over the public, right? Or
so if the on-premises, kind of going back to the whiteboard, if the let's say the on-premise is just like the self-hosted integration runtime, if the on-premises was installed over here, it will be able to route to on-prem, it will be able to route to the private endpoints.
got it. Makes sense. Because it resolves it's going to be the same idea. Even if it's an on-premises, we had to do the same integration that we did with the point to site, correct? Going back to that scenario, we would be able also to resolve the private endpoints with the
Exactly.
proper name resolution configured. That
Right.
makes sense.
Exactly.
Thanks,
And
Nahal.
then where we change it is, so where we would have to change is if we go in connectors. So let's say that our connections over here, you can see, let's see if we can edit this. Yeah, settings. And you can see that somewhere, yeah, see how the gateway cluster name is the virtual network gateway right here.
Correct.
And we would pick the on-premises gateway to pick to create the connections. And that's how
Makes
you
sense.
would connect using that.
Makes sense.
And if it's at the VNET level, so yes, the whole DNS thing will be applicable, like you mentioned.
Applicable.
Yes, yes.
Makes sense. Yeah, because
Yeah,
the source and destination in our scenario are already exposed to a private endpoint, and name resolution plays a core role here to make sure that's going to work from the
exactly.
on-premise perspective.
Yeah, and when we do a deep dive on Fabric, Daniel, maybe we can pick up this piece about on-premises data gateway. This was more designed for just showing that data factory. There is a Fabric data factory as well, and the networking bits. It is evolving, so we will definitely need an update on this one. So we'll add that.
Makes sense.
Perfect. Thank you. And I do have a troubleshooting layer. So if you're following along on the Draw.io, as I work through labbing different scenarios, if I run into an error, I kind of put it in here. And so we just looked at this one. This was the part where often miss, if it's pending, you need to go back into the appropriate PaaS resource and approve it. And this is where I ran into the auto pause issue with the database. So this is the setting. So I'll continue to, and with that, we are nearing the end of our presentation. Daniel, anything else you would like to add? Anything we missed?
No, I think we have a very comprehensive review of all the scenarios, and I appreciated you having me. It was a learning opportunity for me as well, and yeah, thanks for having me.
It was great to have you, Daniel. And this is really like it was a marathon. So really appreciate you being here. It is a long video. I do want to share some of the links with our audience about some of the blogs that Daniel has written. And this is the one that I mentioned about point to site VPN issue that I ran into. And there is a little nugget here that really explains very well why I ran into that. So be sure to check that out. And then, of course, there is this lab that Daniel shared me, and I have to say that this is a very comprehensive lab. So if you're learning about hybrid DNS or private DNS resolver concept, be sure to check that out. And then this is like a gem. So when I was learning DNS integration scenarios, this is really as comprehensive as it can get. So this is a wealth of information in Daniel's blog about DNS. So be sure to check that out. And lastly, everything that I shared today uh, will be available. All the draw IO diagrams. I haven't checked it in. I usually check it in after my um, session. So you'll see that under the diagrams and it will be listed. I don't believe this is the first in the series. I don't believe I have the data architectures. This DB architecture is a little bit old. It's about 2 years ago. So I'll be updating that. So by the time you watch the video, it should be in there. So with that, again, thank you, Daniel. I also want to thank Gabe, who joined us at the beginning of the session, for sharing all the valuable insights. And thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we will see you in the next video.